Okay, part two of my review of The Scramble of Africa by Thomas Pakenham. I had a feeling this was going to happen. My camera only goes for 30 minutes before it automatically turns off, and then I have to do part two. Apologies for the rough editing. I believe I was talking right about the characters in this book. There's a lot of them. For the most part, they're very easy to keep track of because the author does such a good job of giving them memorable descriptions. But around page 400 or so, I will confess to being a bit overwhelmed with the names. Particularly some characters who I hadn't seen for a few hundred pages would sometimes make reappearances, and the author would assume that I still remembered who they were. Sometimes I didn't. Maybe this is unavoidable with a subject this vast, but fortunately, the index is very thorough and very accurate. So I found the index to be very useful for flipping back and forth and refreshing my memory of which character was who. Okay, negative number 2. As part of his literary style, Pakenham will often start his chapters out in the middle of the conflict. He starts with the central conflict, then he moves backwards in time to show how that conflict developed, and then he moves forward to show how the conflict was resolved. This is a deliberate choice on his part, obviously. This is part of his storytelling technique. For the most part, I think it works very well. Once or twice I got confused about the chronology. I didn't catch that we were moving back or forward in time. A couple times I had to reread a chapter to figure out what the chronology was. Not a huge deal, just every once in a while I had to go back and do a little bit of rereading. Okay, negative number 3. Actually, I don't know if this is a negative or not. It depends on your opinion. I was on Amazon reading some reviews of this book, and it's gotten criticized for being Eurocentric, and it totally is. It's about the European explorers in Africa, and it's about the European governments who are negotiating over Africa. It's not about the Africans themselves. Now, to my mind, this falls under the category of review the book that the author wrote, not the book that you wanted the author to write. In other words, the focus of this book is on the Europeans because that's what the author intended. And I think that talking about the scramble for Africa and why the European nations were scrambling over Africa and how they got into this position is the story told from the perspective of the Europeans. Now, there absolutely should be a book from the African perspective as well. It's just that would be a separate book. I actually don't know if that book's been written. Maybe somebody could let me know if you know of a good book. It is noticeable, however, all that being said, it is noticeable that the Africans themselves almost always appear as antagonists of the Europeans or victims of the Europeans. And they seldom get the same in-depth character examinations that Pakenham gives to his European characters. Okay, negative point number 4. Not all events are covered with the same thoroughness. And I suppose that's inevitable, given how vast the subject matter is. Especially if you want to do this in a thorough narrative way, you've got to pick and choose somewhat. Pakenham himself is a British author, so he gives much more attention to the politics inside Britain. We don't get an in-depth examination. We don't get as much of the inside politics of the other countries. Some parts of the Scramble are barely covered at all. At the time I read this book, back in 2011, Libya was in the news all the time with the fall of Gaddafi. And I was really thinking this would be an interesting book to read about how the Italians got into Libya. But it was barely mentioned. It only got a couple sentences. So, I think a consequence of a narrative history is if you want to tell an in-depth story and if you want to kind of get the reader immersed in the story, you have to pick and choose which stories you tell, and there's some picking and choosing. Also, very little is said about Portugal and its colonies, Angola and Mozambique, and there's a good reason for that. Angola and Mozambique were established before the Scramble began. But still, I don't know, it would have been interesting to hear what was going on there. How Portugal was reacting to the Scramble, what was going on in Angola. Especially because, Angola and Mozambique, the conflicts within those countries caused so much trouble during the 1970s and 1980s. So would have been interesting to talk about what was going on in the Scramble. I don't know. You can't put everything in this book. Angola and Mozambique are going to have to be separate books. Okay, one more minor criticism. I would have liked to have more of an epilogue about what happened to the characters after their events in this book. So this book is very good at introducing new characters, going into all their backstories, talking about all their quirks, why they are the way they are. But then, once their part in the action is finished, they just get dropped from the narrative abruptly, and you never hear from them again. So to go back to the example of Henry Stanley, that long quotation I read earlier, we follow him on several adventures in this book. We learn all about his childhood, his insecurities, his love life, his character defects. But then once his part in the action is played out, we never hear what became of him. And that's true of so many characters in this book, where it would have been interesting to have a brief kind of epilogue, what happened to them after Africa, after kind of spending so much time getting to know these characters. Again, that would have made the book even longer yet, but I could have put up with a longer book. I mean, if a book is fascinating to read, length is no problem, huh? Okay, all of these are just quibbles. None of this ruined the book for me. I just wanted to state that. Almost done. Before I finish this review, I'm just going to read out some other random thoughts I had while reading this book, in no particular order. One, in reading this book, I can't help but think of some of the modern parallels. For example, the financial constraints that Europe placed upon Egypt in order to ensure that repaying European investors was a higher priority than feeding the peasants in Egypt struck me as very similar to the structural adjustment policies used by the IMF nowadays. The suppression of popular nationalist uprisings in Egypt under the justification of maintaining stability also struck me as having modern overtones. It's noticeable how often invading armies are sent in for the good of the native peoples. Random thought number 2. Sometimes when reading history, it never ceases to shock you what one human being is willing to do to another human being for the sake of financial gain. And there are plenty examples of that in this book. The Belgians in the Congo is the preeminent example of this book. It is incredibly barbaric what the Belgians did in the Congo during this period. And this comes through in this book. And it is just sickening. And it just makes you lose your faith in humanity when you think about what humans can do to each other. And yet, on the other hand, there are stories in the same book about humanitarians in Britain and the United States who worked to try and expose what was going on in the Congo and to expose these atrocities. So the incongruity of this period where you have these horrible barbaric things happening in the Belgian Congo, but you also have this international movement to try and stop what was going on in the Belgian Congo, struck me as very interesting and maybe somewhat similar to our own period. Because this is not the dark ages of history. This is at a time during the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century when I think the values were largely the same as they are nowadays. In spite of all the barbaric things that went on. Thomas Pakenham uses a quote from Joseph Conrad, which I thought was very insightful. This is on page 656 of the book. Thomas Pakenham quoting Joseph Conrad, quote, "It is an extraordinary thing that the conscience of Europe, which 70 years ago has put down the slave trade on humanitarian grounds, tolerates the Congo state today. It is as if the moral clock had been put back. And I think that conflict is part of what makes this book so fascinating. And makes this period in general very fascinating. Okay, random thought number 3. This book was published in 1991 when apparently Robert Mugabe still had a rather positive image. There's a short 10-page epilogue on the decolonization process in Africa. And it describes Robert Mugabe as a pragmatist and a statesman in the making. Apparently back in 1991 he still had a positive reputation. Okay, next random thought. Thomas Pakenham says in the introduction that before he wrote this book, there was no other single-volume history of the Scramble of Africa, which sounds kind of bizarre, huh? I mean, everybody knows about the Scramble of Africa. I mean, they know about it in general terms, meaning they've heard the word mentioned in their history class. It's hard to believe that this was the first single-volume history written about it, but apparently it was. Okay, lastly, maybe this is only of interest to me, but there are a number of things in this book that overlap with other books I've reviewed on this channel. So I'm going to talk about them, and if you're not interested, you can stop watching now. But Three Empires on the Nile by Dominic Green overlaps heavily with this book. The difference is that Three Empires on the Nile is only dealing with Egypt and the Sudan during this period. Whereas this book is dealing with Egypt and Sudan and the rest of Africa. But they're both covering the same time period, and they're both covering the same events during Egypt and Sudan. It's always interesting to see the different focuses that different authors have on things. There are some interesting anecdotes that Pakenham has in this book that are overlooked in Three Empires on the Nile and vice versa. Also, because this book starts out in the 1870s, many of the prominent French and British politicians of this period are the same ones that were involved in the Franco-Prussian War and were described in The Fall of Paris by Alistair Horn, which I reviewed on this channel. Men like Jules Ferry, Leon Gambetta on the French side, and Bismarck and Kaiser Wilhelm I and Crown Prince Frederick III on the German side. Some of the scenes in this book also remind me of King Solomon's Mines. I think I'm able to understand the inspiration for that book now after having read this book. The author of King Solomon's Mines was actually living in South Africa during this period, and he actually makes a brief appearance as one of the characters in this book. I also reviewed on this channel a review of a biography of Sir Captain Francis Richard Burton, who near the end of his life was famous for exploring the sources of the Nile. This book takes place just a little bit after the age of Burton, but in the opening chapters it does cite some of Burton's explorations as background. And then finally, as I mentioned in my previous review, which was the historical fiction book Flashman and the Dragon, a lot of the characters that were, or historical figures that were prominent in the Arrow War in China at that period would later go on to Africa. So Charles Gordon, Henry Locke, Sir Garnet Wolseley were all in Flashman and the Dragon, and they're all featured prominently in this book. Yes, it's actually, speaking of Charles Gordon, when I first started this book, I was still living in Melbourne at the time, and I was actually reading it initially as a way to procrastinate on the thesis I was supposed to be writing. Good books are a little bit dangerous like that. You think, okay, I'm just going to spend like 10 minutes reading The Scramble for Africa, but then you just get absorbed in it. And there's actually a statue of Charles Gordon